is we have hope for this country. And as believers, we do. And we still do. Now, some days it's harder to hope than others. Some days we're just as angry as others in the country.
So, on today's episode, I'm joined by my colleague and brother in Christ, Pastor Marwan Aboul-Zelof. Marwan is the lead pastor at City Bible Church in Beirut, Lebanon. And I wanted to have Marwan join me on All Things for a couple reasons. The first is that Lebanon has been in the headlines many times over the past few years. No doubt every listener remembers the silos which exploded in the Port of Beirut over 2 years ago in August of 2022. And then more recently, we are hearing about the financial collapse in Lebanon, and even just citizens going into the banks there and attempting to get their money out of the failing banks by holding them up at gunpoint. A recent podcast I heard from the BBC said that about 80% of citizens in Lebanon are living at the poverty level. I found that to be really striking. So I just wanted to connect with Pastor Marwan and hear more about the headlines there. And then the second reason is I wanted to hear about what it's like to follow Christ in that setting and what it's like for him to pastor a congregation in the midst of tragedy and suffering and injustice, and what it's like to be faithful to the Lord and faithful to one another in a setting like that. So, Marwan, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, my pleasure. A joy to be with you, Jen. Good morning to you.
Thank you. Okay, well, why don't you start by giving us a little bit of your story? What took you to Beirut? Tell us briefly maybe about your family, your calling, and what led to your church plant there in Beirut.
Yeah, sure. All these stories are always quite long, so I'll try to keep them brief. If there's anything, maybe you say, "Hey, tell us a little bit more." Happy to do that. If I may, even before we start, I just want to say I'm thankful for you. We've not yet met in person. We've kind of seen each other from afar, but just even I was looking past through our past kind of messages on Instagram, and just how encouraged I have been by you and your family, just sending us notes of encouragement, following up. Yeah, I've read them to my wife, and we're just both. It's incredible, as you know, living overseas for such a long time. Those things matter to know people are
Yeah,
praying for you, and so I'm thankful for
mhm,
you. And
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So the quick story, or the shorter version of the story, is I was born in the Middle East. My mother is Chaldean. My father is Lebanese, Palestinian. I was born in Kuwait, so kind of a mix of the region. We ended up in the U.S. As a result of the Gulf War, actually on vacation in San Diego in summer of 1990, and then Iraq invaded Kuwait a day before we were supposed to fly back to Kuwait, and so that's kind of what brought me to the U.S. And kept me in the U.S. I was raised in a nominal, Catholic home, so we knew of Jesus, but I didn't know Christ Himself, and so at a young age, the Lord saved me and called me to Him, and so can fast forward a bit to high school years, university years, just sensing a call to serve the Lord. Of course, at a young age, you don't know what that looks like. There's more questions than answers. But I remember pretty vividly in my university years, uh, the best way I can describe it is that my eyes were open to lostness. Um, Growing in my love for Christ, his affections for the church, seeing the need all around me, but just kind of my eyes were open that there are people all around the world who have never heard the name of Christ, have never um, heard that the gospel message, and so I was impacted by that. It was that, along with recognizing the need in the Middle East, kind of how Islam is continuing to grow, and how many people have left the region over the years. And so it's kind of a combination, I think, the Lord used of seeing a need and a desire to go back while many people were leaving. I felt the Lord was calling me back. Now, that was in my early 20s. Between, let's say 20 to 30, uh, a love for the local church grew. My wife, Marcy, and I guess I should mention, married to Marcy for 12 years. We have two young boys. Noah is 7 and Shia is 5. And so this story is before their time. We moved back to her home state of Arkansas, and it was there we were part of a church plant, and we fell in love with the local church. Both Marcy and I had a call to go, kind of again a general call that slowly kind of grew more specific into um, pouring into the local church, eventually church planting. Um, but it was our time in a local church that made us say, "Hey, this is what we want to see. This is the way of Christ. this is what we read in the scriptures, that it's through community that God most clearly makes himself known through the preached word in the local church. And so, again, so that kind of took place late 20s. And then it was, okay, we want to go. How do we get there? Again, that's a big question for those who are sent. Again, a long story, but ultimately we took a short trip. My wife, myself, and our pastor at the time, Bobby Biggers from Russellville, Arkansas, and we went to see what the Lord was doing. We visited Dubai, visited Lebanon, Egypt, and Jordan, all in a 2 week period, just to see, Lord, what are you doing? Are there opportunities for us to serve? We want to pray. We brought our pastor along so that he can speak into it. We recognize that the church wants to, we want the church to speak into our life in this way. And um, so I went to Dubai as as an intern. I was invited to do a pastoral internship program with the Redeemer Church of Dubai, with Dave Furman, and so spent 2 years there. But the plan was always to go to Lebanon.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a dual citizen, Lebanese and an American citizen. So I was just something there, seeing the need, the opportunity to move back to Lebanon. I'd never lived here before, but the Lord opened a door for us to come here. And I'll just mention one thing about our church currently. Again, early on, there wasn't a desire. I didn't say I want to be a church planter and this is what we're going to do. It was more just praying and seeking, having conversations. I pastor an English-speaking church. I can speak Arabic nearly fluent conversationally, not well enough where I can preach, but I'm not very far off from that. So the question is, why am I pastoring an English speaking church? Well, we spoke with locals. A prominent Lebanese pastor here told us, as we asked him, what are the needs in the city? He said, we need English speaking churches. That's one way we're going to reach some Lebanese an Arabic church can't reach. And so, again, lots more details, and I'll kind of close it down here. But we moved to Beirut October 17th, 2016, and City Bible Church was planted in uh, spring of 2018. So we're going on 5 years as a church plant.
Wow, that is thrilling. My heart is for the global church and global missions, and just hearing you tell this story tempts me to go pack my suitcase.
Yeah,
It's just really, it's so encouraging. Okay, can we rewind just briefly?
sure.
Did I hear you right? You were on vacation with your family, and that led to your sudden relocation, or yeah, not even
Yeah,
relocation, just your sudden migration to the
yeah,
United States. You thought you were
yep.
going on vacation, that you would go back home, and you never did.
That's right. Yeah, and it's incredible to think it was a day difference. So my mother's parents emigrated to the U.S. to San Diego, 1980, I think it was. And so, every couple of years, we would go visit family in the US, SeaWorld, Disneyland, which is kind of surreal because now as an adult, I'm here in the Middle East, and every year or two, we take my children back to the US and they get to see their family. And so, yeah, summer 1990, we're in San Diego. August 3rd, 1990 was supposed to be our flight back to Kuwait, where we were living. August 2nd, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, so we weren't able to travel back. So, of course, I didn't understand the incredible providence and the work of
Yes,
the Lord. But looking back now, it's incredible. A day difference uh, changed the entire trajectory of my life. And so,
that is
yeah,
amazing. And
God's
I'm thinking
kindness.
back to my own life. I was a middle school student back then, and I remember that day very clearly. I
Mm,
remember, when everything began in Kuwait. And
yeah,
just to think that, a peer of mine who was meant to return ended up relocating to San Diego. How do your parents feel that you you have transitioned your life back to the Middle East when, are they in the I guess they're in the United States and you've made a
there.
different decision?
Yeah, mixed feelings. We've had different conversations. Mixed feelings for different reasons.
Yeah.
I think, of course, they're supportive as much as
Mm,
grandparents without being near
I
to their
understand.
grandkids can be. But I think there is a factor. It's like we've done all this to get to the U.S. In some ways, and then
Mhm.
you've gone back. But
Yeah.
my answer to them and to others, same thing that Marcy told her parents and our communities. Um, the call of the Christian is to be faithful to following Christ.
Yeah.
Now, for some people, that could be being faithful and staying in the same 5 mile radius for your entire life.
Mhm.
For others, it's to go to another part of the world. And so for us,
Yes.
this is what it looks like for us to follow Jesus. And
Yes.
so difficult for sure in lots of ways,
I
but
understand.
God's been kind.
Yeah. So grateful for your faithfulness. I mean, that brings me really to my next question. How is life different for you in Lebanon than it would be if you stayed in the United States? How
Yeah.
does it compare?
Yeah. Again, short podcasts, so short answers, but you can follow up on these answers. Life is life. Not to oversimplify, but there's you're always learning, you're always adapting. Now again, if we're comparing life in Beirut, Lebanon, in 2000, in the 2020 through 22, these last several years with life in the U.S., uh, we can say that things are more complicated, certainly more difficult uh, in regular everyday ways. From small things to big things, just everyday things, there are challenges that we, again, by God's grace, learn to adapt to. If it wasn't for Jesus, we wouldn't be here. Maybe that's a way to kind of explain the difference of life. Just decisions of um, grocery shopping and traffic and the pollution and education systems, and I mean, life is life, and so we're thankful to be here. We pray that the Lord will continue to persevere us and sustain us so we can remain here. It's our desire to remain. And again, God has been gracious to us, but things are more difficult for our children, just for kind of everyday lives. Well, one example I can share: people ask me, "What's it like to plant a church in Lebanon?" You know, there's different ways to answer that question, but I kind of say church planting is hard. You all know. I mean, church planting is difficult. Pastoring is difficult, and so all the challenges that come with any small new church are ones that we've experienced. Learning how to be a regular preacher while caring for young Christians, and sin in the church, the challenge of growing, and all the challenges that we experience as a small church. But now put that in an overseas context. There's more challenges, right? Just because there's not the support systems that are normally there, the friends, the family, whatever it might be. Now, have that overseas context be Beirut, Lebanon, and add a revolution, an economic collapse, uh, our church exploded, our city exploded, a pandemic. So these are these are additional things, and I don't know how clear the light is, but I've gotten a lot more white hairs in my beard over the years. But again, I really do mean it when I say the Lord has been faithful to us in ways that we don't deserve. He's been kind to us, and so more complicated, yes, more challenging, certainly, um, but God is faithful to His people, and so He's kept us through a lot more than we expected.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so thankful for your perspective that is really rooted in God's faithfulness. I think for the average listener who maybe is really unfamiliar with anything going on in Lebanon, you know, your perspective, which is rooted in the goodness of God, has made it sound like it's not that different from the United States. It's just a little more difficult.
Right.
But what I know, because I have been paying attention to the headlines and I do listen to podcasts about Lebanon and I do read the news stories,
Yeah.
is that there are things, on the daily, you're dealing with a shortage of medicine, or shortage of,
Yeah.
internet going out, electricity going out, water going out. I mean,
Yeah.
so that, maybe to the average listener feels like a little heavier than complicated.
Yeah, certainly. And again, I think I try not to over brighten things that are meant to be dark and heavy.
Yeah.
And so certainly, so there's the experience of God's kindness and care, but literally every aspect of life is more challenging.
Mm,
Um, just even doing laundry. We have, I think, 7 8 hours a day that we don't have electricity. Um, the, for more detail, as you mentioned, I'm speaking to a friend who's familiar with these things, and we've kind of talked offline. But for maybe the listener who has no idea what's happening, so we get maybe an hour of electricity a day from the government. The rest of that is from a building generator. But because uh, diesel costs are expensive, because generators aren't meant to run 24 hours a day, uh, because of all the different reasons, we have, I think, maybe about 15 hours of electricity a day. So um, what you're thinking about is laundry and hot water, um, and the food spoiling in the refrigerator. Again, we've learned to we have some routines, and my wife's a rock star to kind of figure out how to just do all this with changing, because it's not always the set amount of hours that are off. We're kind of changing, adapting, picking up kids. It's interesting because to kind of again lighten the heavy. sometimes the most challenging thing in our lives in Lebanon, just parenting young children. So of course, I think being here adds to that challenge. Um, but no, yeah, medicine. I haven't thought about that in some time. Things are a little bit better. They're
Mhm.
very expensive, but at least you can find medicine again. There was a
Mm.
time, I think a little bit over a year ago, looking for medicine for my wife and one of my sons. I went to over 40 pharmacies. I would
Amazing.
have paid $100. Thank God that I was able to just kind of throw that money out there if we needed to. I mean,
Yeah.
having a connection with the West, we're some of the pains that we're experiencing or that many experience are alleviated, and we don't take that lightly. We're
Yeah.
mindful of how much easier we have it. With all these challenges, it's still much easier for us than
Mm.
for many of our friends. And like you said,
Mm.
over 80% are living below the poverty line. Um, but to go to 40 pharmacies to look for medicine
It's
that we
unreal.
needed. That adds stress and anxiety. And again, so part of the reason we're here is um, to point people to Christ in the midst of all these chaos and the challenges, which I know we'll talk a bit more about that.
Right. Yeah. So regarding medicine, for example, I mean, the headlines that I saw, I think maybe last month or the month prior, of young people holding up banks at gunpoint because of a need to get their money out of the banks to pay for, one young woman, it was to pay for cancer treatment for her sister, just
Yeah,
needing to get her hands on that money so that she could provide care for her family member.
yeah,
um, how do ordinary, and I know Lebanon's not a monolith, it's a diverse population with diverse perspectives, but
yeah,
just sort of the ordinary man on the street in Lebanon, what do they think of the current state of affairs? And I know that's a huge question, but
yeah,
how do they view it?
yeah. Most people are angry with the government and the politicians, excuse me, rightly so. Lebanon has one of the most corrupt ruling class in the entire world. And so we have the right to point to those who have taken office and saying, you are corrupt, you're unjust. Um, Lebanon hasn't had 24-hour electricity for 30 years. We had it in the city when we first moved out here, 21 hours a day, which was fine because the other 3 hours were just generator. But the reason is because generators and diesel fuel make a lot of money. It's not because Lebanon can't provide 24-hour electricity. But that, I mean, take that down to every level. The traffic, there's multiple garbage crises that have happened over the years. That's because landfills get filled and contracts aren't paid. Uh, I got my first car accident ever driving for 20 plus years here because there's no traffic lights. That's not because of the no electricity. That's what I thought eventually, but or initially, that's because a contractor who paid for the software system never got paid, and so the government isn't able to pay their bills, and so that's because money is stolen. And so these what I've called them is aggressive withdrawals. It's not stealing; it's going and saying, "I want my money. You have it." And it's because the insurance, again, because of corruption, because of all the different things, isn't paying the bills that they're supposed to pay. Um, and so most people rightly point their finger at the government,
Mm.
who have brought um, lots of the problems upon us and upon the country. Um, yeah, it's interesting. I'm remembering now a conversation I had with a taxi driver. There's a little project I did with an artist friend of mine, take a photo of a taxi driver and have a conversation with him. He would sketch it and kind of put a quote. So of course, just talking about gas prices and the taxi prices and the needs. And again, most people rightly point at the government. There is real deep corruption that would change with more honest people. And so again, that's a whole podcast in its own. But I remember one taxi driver said, "It's all our fault." So it doesn't matter who the person is. We all would do the same thing. And I just was like, man, I wish I had enough time to dig in with him, as kind of pointing to kind of the human nature, sin nature that we have. That we didn't have to learn how to steal or to do this. It's who we are. And I was kind of blown away. But I think he kind of stands out as pointing the finger at himself and
Mm.
all of us, as opposed to most pointing to the politicians, the banks, and so on.
Yeah, the as I've learned over the last several months and few years about what's happening in Lebanon, it does seem incredibly complicated. I mean,
Mm.
bottom line is it's corruption, it's greed,
Yeah,
it's the corrupt ruling class, as you have sort of illustrated for us. But it
yeah,
also feels incredibly complicated, and that temptation for those who have power to do what those who've before them have done as well, and to
right,
grab finances or power or whatever it is that you can grab when you're in that position.
right.
Is there hope in Lebanon? Do you feel like the population has hope? Or, I know that a ton of young people, the norm is to leave Lebanon and then send money back.
Yeah,
What is there a spirit of hope or not?
Mostly not. And if it is hope, it's misplaced hope.
Hmm.
When we first came out here, I have this conversation weekly, which is great. It's a great opportunity to build relationships and to, if time permits, to share the gospel. But because I'm kind of what I introduce myself as a cocktail, right? I'm a mix of my mother's Chaldean, dad's Lebanese, Palestinian. I was born in Kuwait, raised in the U.S. And so when I speak Arabic, even though I'm, again, conversationally fluent, people can't pin me down. They can't figure out my dialect. So where are you from? And so again, I kind of go through that spiel, and then I tell them I was in the U.S. For most people, they're like, "You have a passport? Like, what are you doing here?" Well, and again, that conversation has shifted a bit and become a bit more aggressive over the more recent time. But the answer that we always give is that we have hope for this country. Um, and as believers, we do, and we still do. Now, some days it's harder to hope than others. Some days we're just as angry as others in the country, and you know, um, whenever the fourth of every month comes, this August 4th of 2020 was when the explosion happened. There still hasn't been one arrest. Not
Wow.
one person has been arrested.
Wow.
That's because people are working hard against uh, the investigation. And so there are times that anger rules out. But for us, even this past Sunday, the sermon on Christmas was, we considered a thrill of hope, and just the hope that comes with Christ. And even uh,
Mhm.
I chose at one point to go through the book of First Peter, as we considered what it looks like for us to have a living hope in the midst of destruction all around us. And so I think, to go back to your question, I think most people have a misplaced hope, and that is, if I get this passport, if I get this visa out of the country, I'll be able to have a new life. Um, and we've had tens of thousands have left. The brightest, the people who are able to, have left. Many have remained, and it's encouraging when there are people who are choosing to live through difficult times. But hope, again, that's what we share at church. We believe that the greatest hope for our city are people who are renewed by the message and the power of Jesus Christ. And that in the midst of all the darkness and all the brokenness and all the challenges, that God's people will be marked with hope. Um, and we have a hope that remains. It's not based on our health. Then a pandemic comes through, right? It's not based on our savings. The banks steal your money. It's not based on homes. We finally bought a house. Well, our house exploded, but it's a hope that remains because of Christ. And
Mm.
so, um, yeah, it's a difficult message for some people to receive, because there's just so much crisis.
Yeah.
It's not just one thing. It's not just the pandemic we all went through, but most people didn't also lose their currency. The current rates right now, imagine $1,000 being valued at $40. That's
Mm.
that's how much the value has dropped of the local currency, and no access to that $40. It's
Right.
limited access. That's why people are going to the banks and holding up their own banks to get their own money. Um, but it's the message we continue to preach. We have a living hope, and we've seen it by God's grace. People who have come to faith, and have experienced this peace in the midst of chaos.
Mm.
They can
Mm.
only come through Christ, and we know that.
Yeah.
And so we pray that the Lord will continue to sustain us and other believers in the country, so that way we can continue to share the hope of Christ.
Yeah. Amen. So I'm hearing obviously about tremendous injustice and corruption. How do you pastor your congregation in the face of injustice? What are those conversations like? Are those sermons
Hmm.
like? Or what are your own internal thoughts like? Um, what you're living through is tiring, and
Yeah,
injustice is a unique, in and of itself, it will weary a soul.
yeah,
So what are the things that you rehearse to yourself and preach to your congregation about injustice?
yeah. Sometimes pastoring in a place like Beirut uh, is easier when we address, or sorry, easier in light of the corruption and the injustices that happen, because um, the lies of the world and the false hope that sometimes will capture our eyes, uh, riches and wealth and whatever it might be. We all have idols that we continue to create. In Lebanon, uh, it's easier to see the lie. It's
Mm,
easier to see the emptiness behind the whatever the facade might be. And so in one ways, I can just point to
mhm,
this example, or this injustice, and then point to a Christ who's faithful, to a God who is just, and who has proven Himself to us. So in one way, when it comes to preaching examples and illustrations, I don't have to sell um, or convince of the brokenness of the world.
right.
We see it, we feel it.
Mm,
It's undeniable.
yeah.
On another part, or let's say the flip side of pastoring in this place, with such challenges and injustices, is people are hurting. People are
Yeah.
hurting in such deep ways. We have folks who are middle class, working fine, not very wealthy, and again, and middle class, upper middle class, uh, across the board, now are having to skip meals
Mm,
for their children to eat.
mm,
Uh, Christmas celebrations don't look the same way as they used to, and so the challenge of strengthening those, it's beautiful again when we see God's kindness in allowing them and us to see Him more beautifully in the midst of the darkness, but also just it brings challenges. You know, we don't have the luxury to say, well, we don't do relief work anymore. When our
mm,
neighborhood explodes, well, we need to help our neighbors.
right.
And so, what does it look like to do food distribution and home repair and these kinds of things? So, there's lots of challenges that have come alongside uh, the difficulties that we have in the country. It's made shepherding look different.
Mhm.
Considering benevolence, for example, as something that's will take more time than we previously have, or would have done maybe. Um, Lots of challenges. Um, but for me as a pastor, I've just seen God's faithfulness.
Yeah.
We have, from our knowledge, I think three who have come to faith in the life of our church, and two of them in this last year. This year, I mix up the
Praise
years.
God.
In the middle of of all that's happening, God's still saving. God's still
Yes.
making Himself known, and that just shows that's not me. That's something that we can do. It's not a program. It's the power of the gospel, and so
Yes.
it reminds me as well. I can't offer anything to anyone,
Mm.
um, in and of myself or our family, but Christ can, and we
Amen.
just continue to preach Him as much as we were able to.
Right. How can listeners who are believers, how can the global church come alongside the church in Beirut?
Yeah,
Oftentimes, on all things, I talk about things that are around the world, and we don't know how we can impact that
yeah,
situation in any way. Is there something that a listener can do to come alongside your church?
yeah. I remember us in your prayers.
Hmm.
It's hard. It's hard. I'm on social media, and so I read about things, and I know what's happening around the world, and I'm shocked sometimes at the things that I didn't know, that there's things happening in Ethiopia and the drought, and I sometimes forget that there's the fighting in Ukraine, just because we have our own thing. So I know how easy it is to forget something incredible uh, that someone else is experiencing. So I know that Lebanon's news and the needs here sometimes just kind of get uh, you know, shuffled in with other issues around the world. And so, as the Lord leads, remember us in your prayers. Pray
Mm,
for our church. Pray for those to be softened. I think in one way, crisis will sometimes open you up and cause you to ask questions that maybe you wouldn't have asked before.
yeah.
Um, I think too much crisis might harden a people. At least that's been our
Mm,
experience. For some, they're open, but for some, it's like they can't have a conversation because all they're thinking about is their next meal and medicine and finding another job that's going to pay them um, not enough, right? And
yeah.
so just pray that God would continue to do His work, that He would strengthen believers in the country. Praying for we're currently don't have a president. They still haven't. They're kind of back to no president. We're trying to elect one. Um, and so who knows how long that'll be when there's kind of another vacuum in another part of the government. And so just praying for the leaders in our country. Lebanon is it's an incredibly beautiful place. Come out and visit. We're actually praying about doing some sort of trip where we just invite friends and partners and those who want to see the work of what the Lord's doing. Go to Tyre and Sidon, and kind of just see the history of this beautiful country. But Lebanon has, and thinking Beirut specifically, has always been so strategic, and that's one of the reasons we came out here. Um, I think the way that you reach the Middle East is through Beirut. Beirut has always been influential and strategic when it comes to um, really everything: medicine, law, politics, fashion, food. And so our hope is that also would be strategic for the spread of the gospel through the region. And so, yeah, so pray for us,
Yeah.
connect with us. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah,
How do we do that? Where can people follow your church or your family, your ministry?
yeah. I, I can email. I don't know if you want, I can share it now or just, yeah. So Marwan at cbcbeirut.com. I'm on social media, Twitter, Instagram. Um, and I was going to say we can add you to a newsletter list, but I'm not very faithful to writing these newsletters as we used to. So they're not as regular. We're actually months overdue on one. But there's ways to connect with us on Facebook as well. I don't know if you'll have a place to put all kind of our details. So
Yes. Yeah.
we'd
I
love
could
to get an
definitely link all
email
that.
or yeah, to be able to connect with you all and let you know what's happening. And again, kind of how I started off by just saying these little messages are encouraging. Um, After the explosion, I had dozens and dozens of emails and messages from people I'd never spoken to who just said, "We're praying for you." And that's not just a vague thing, that means something.
Mm,
It's one of the ways that the Lord has connected us to one another. And so those things matter to us. And so,
yeah.
yeah,
Well, I can testify that following you on social media is very encouraging. I love to just get that little glimpse, that window into your world and just see what everyday life is like. When you post scenes from your neighborhood or scenes of what your kids' days are like, it's really helpful. And so
yeah,
that is one of the blessings of social media. I know we curse its name all the
certainly.
time,
Yeah,
but also it's a window into the global church. And so I would encourage
yeah,
listeners to follow you, and I will link all of that in the show notes. But Pastor
great.
Marwan, thank you for your ministry and thank you for sharing your life and the gospel and the good news with us and
Yeah,
with Beirut. So grateful for you.
my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to All Things with Jen Oshman, where we look at events and trends through a Christian lens. All things were created through Jesus and for Jesus, so we're seeking to apply His word to what's happening here and now.